Andrew Moore was a man whose name carried weight across boardrooms from New York to San Francisco, whispered with equal parts admiration and envy. At 45, he had achieved what most men only dared to dream of. His empire, built on cutting-edge technology and ruthless efficiency, sprawled globally. He owned penthouses in Manhattan, estates in the Hamptons, and a winter villa in the Swiss Alps. His days were scheduled with military precision. His nights were spent in rooms lined with glass, overlooking cities that pulsed with the energy of dreams he no longer shared. On the surface, Andrew was the embodiment of triumph. Every magazine cover that featured his sharp profile proclaimed him as the face of American ambition, a billionaire, a genius, a conqueror of industries. Yet when the last meeting ended and the last glass of vintage wine was poured, when the laughter of acquaintances faded into silence, he was left alone with a truth he could not outspend, outbuild, or outmaneuver. His empire was vast, but his bloodline was empty. It was a truth that haunted him more in recent years, as streaks of silver appeared at his temples, and the echoes of his failed marriages sharpened into permanent scars. He had married twice, once in his early 30s, to a woman named Evelyn, whose beauty was as brilliant as it was fleeting. The marriage had ended in flames of betrayal and bitterness. His second attempt with Cassandra, a philanthropist, who seemed flawless on paper, dissolved under the weight of his obsession with control and her hunger for freedom. Both women had left with their share of his fortune, but what they could never give him was the one thing he wanted most, an heir. Andrew's disdain for love grew in the aftermath. To him, love was a mirage, a promise that dissolved when one reached for it. He began to see relationships as contracts dressed up in sentiment ribbons doomed to unravel. But children were different. They were not fleeting promises or fragile emotions. They were legacy continuity, a future carved from the blood of one's veins. To Andrew, having a child was no longer about family, in the traditional sense. It was about building something that outlived him, a monument that bore his name long after his empire turned to dust. He told himself it was rational, pragmatic. What use was love, with its betrayals and heartbreaks, when he truly needed an heir? A son, perhaps, who could carry the Moore name into the next century, or a daughter whose brilliance could eclipse his own. Love had failed him, but a contract never would. And so, in the dim hours, when Manhattan's skyline glimmered outside his glass walls, Andrew drafted plans, not for mergers or acquisitions, but for life itself. The thought first came to him one winter night. The city below was dressed in snow, glittering under streetlights like a million crystal shards. He sat alone in his penthouse, nursing a glass of whiskey that had long lost its warmth. The fire in the marble hearth crackled, filling the silence with a hollow music. He stared at the flames and realized with startling clarity that all the power he held, all the wealth he commanded, could not conjure an heir from the void of his solitude. Then the idea began to take root. Not adoption, not another ill-fated marriage, but an arrangement stripped of sentiment, bound only by legality. A woman healthy and willing, who would carry his child. No love, no romance, no illusions. Just an exchange clean and unambiguous. She would walk away with financial freedom. He would remain with his heir. Andrew had lived his life orchestrating deals worth billions. What was one more contract if it secured the one thing he could not buy on Wall Street? Yet even as he shaped this plan, a dissonance lingered within him, a quiet ache he refused to name. Late at night, when silence pressed too heavily against his chest, he sometimes imagined a child's laughter echoing through the empty halls of his mansion in Long Island. He pictured small footsteps pattering across marble floors, the soft weight of a tiny hand gripping his finger. And though he told himself it was about legacy, the image burned with something dangerously close to longing. The following weeks passed in a haze of research and discreet inquiries. Andrew spoke to lawyers, drafted clauses, and envisioned every possible complication. He was meticulous, leaving no stone unturned. His legal team produced a document as precise as any merger agreement, binding and irreversible. All that remained was the woman, a vessel. As he tried to tell himself, though, the word tasted bitter, even in his mind. But how did one choose such a woman? He could have gone through agencies, reached out to discreet services that specialized in surrogacy. Yet for reasons he could not fully articulate, that felt wrong. Too clinical, too predictable. Andrew wanted control, but also wanted authenticity, something raw and unpolished. Perhaps in some buried corner of his mind, he wanted a story to tell his heirs, one day. A story that began not with paperwork, but with fate. It was on one of these restless days, as he drove his sleek black Aston Martin through the chaotic streets of New York, that Andrew's path shifted. The winter air bit at the city's edges, and people hurried across sidewalks bundled in scarves and coats. He had no destination in mind, only a desire to escape the suffocating quiet of his penthouse. His gaze drifted idly to the sidewalk at a red light in the Bronx. That was when he saw her. She sat on the cold pavement near a graffiti-stained wall, her knees drawn to her chest, a sheet of crumpled paper balanced on them. In her hands was a dull pencil, its wood chipped, its point worn. Yet, as the world rushed past her, she drew. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that ignored the chaos around her, her eyes focused with fierce serenity. Her hair, thick and coiled, framed her face in disarray, but her eyes, dark, luminous, glowed with a determination that defied the ragged coat wrapped around her shoulders. Addison Carter. Though Andrew did not yet know her name, he could not look away. For a brief moment, their worlds collided in silence. He, a man encased in leather seats, worth more than she could dream of. She, a woman invisible to most, surviving on the margins of a city that devoured the weak. Something about her presence struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. The light turned green. Horns blared behind him, urging him forward. He pressed the accelerator, the car gliding away, but his mind remained tethered to the image of the woman on the sidewalk, pencil scratching against paper, as though nothing else existed. He wondered who sketches in the cold when the world has already stripped you of everything. For several blocks he tried to shake the thought. He told himself it was absurd. She was irrelevant to his plans, a distraction. Yet the image refused to fade. By the time he pulled into a parking lot, his hands gripping the wheel too tightly, his dissonance had swelled into something undeniable. Ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. And yet, as if propelled by something greater than logic, Andrew turned the car around. The streets of the Bronx blurred past, as Andrew steered his car back toward where he had seen her. A restless unease pressed at his chest, like some unseen hand had reached into his carefully ordered life and shifted everything by a single inch. That was all it took, a single inch, for the ground beneath him to no longer feel steady. And then he saw her again. Addison was still cross-legged on the cold pavement, her pencil gliding across the battered paper. The world moved indifferently around her footsteps, rushing voices colliding, the endless clatter of the city. Yet she was cocooned in a silence of her own, making each line. She drew a quiet defiance against invisibility. Andrew pulled his car to the curb. The hum of the engine drew her eyes up at last. For a second, their gazes locked. Hers was sharp, untrusting, a shield forged from years of survival. He was cold, assessing, but beneath the calculation lay something he could not name. He lowered the window. "You. Come here." Her brows knitted together, suspicion flaring in the depth of her stare. She did not move. "I'm not asking." Andrew said, his voice clipped a tone he often used to close billion-dollar deals. "Come here. I don't have all day." Addison hesitated, her grip tightening on the paper in her hands. Everything about him screamed danger. His tailored suit, the sleek car, the command in his voice that assumed obedience. Yet curiosity tugged at her, reluctant but insistent. Slowly, warily, she rose to her feet and approached. Up close, the reality of her condition revealed itself more starkly. Her coat was frayed, and her shoes were worn thin. Her face was tired, but her eyes burned with life, with an unbroken fire that unsettled Andrew. He was used to people lowering their gaze before him, not challenging him with silence. "What do you want?" she asked finally, her voice low but steady. "Get in," Andrew said. "I'll take you somewhere we can talk." Addison let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Talk? Is that what men in expensive cars call it now?" His jaw tightened. "Don't be absurd. I'm not interested in that," I said. "Talk." The firmness of his tone left little room for argument, and though every instinct screamed for her to walk away, Addison's survival instincts whispered something else. A man like him could change the course of her night, perhaps her life. That kind of power was dangerous, but it was also impossible to ignore. With visible reluctance, she slid into the passenger seat. The silence in the car was heavy, oppressive. Andrew didn't fill it. He was a man accustomed to silence, to letting others squirm until they spoke. Addison, however, stared out the window, her face set in defiance. They drove until the noise of the city softened. Finally, Andrew pulled up outside a quiet cafe in a corner of Harlem. He stepped out, his movements deliberate, controlled, then opened the door for her. "After you," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. Inside the cafe was nearly empty. The faint hum of jazz floated from a speaker, mingling with the scent of roasted coffee beans. They took a table near the back, away from curious eyes. Andrew studied her across the table. "Your name," he said. "Addison Carter," she replied, her chin lifting as if daring him to find fault in it. "Why does it matter?" "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, Addison, why do you sit on sidewalks drawing while the world rushes past you?" She shrugged, looking away. "What else is there to do? I lost everything." "But that's none of your business." "It could be." Her eyes narrowed. "What is that supposed to mean?" Andrew exhaled as though tiring of the prelude. "I'll be direct. I want to make you an offer that will change your life." Addison barked a humorless laugh. "Men like you always have offers. I've heard them before. They usually come with chains." "This one comes with freedom," Andrew said calmly. "I want you to have a child for me." The words hung in the air, incongruous against the cozy clatter of cups in the distance. Addison blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me, I'm not joking," Andrew replied. His voice was flat, clinical, like he was discussing a quarterly report. "I will provide everything you need. Medical care, housing, security. Ultimately, you'll receive enough money to ensure you never have to live on the streets again." Her lips parted, then closed again. A storm of emotions flickered across her face: shock, anger, disbelief, and beneath it all, a flash of temptation. She hated herself for feeling. "You're insane," she said finally. "What kind of man makes that kind of offer to a stranger? The kind who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time." Andrew replied without missing a beat. I don't want a relationship. I don't like drama. I want a child. Simple as that. Addison stared at him, trying to read the sincerity behind the steel in his tone. Everything about him screamed control calculation. Yet there was no trace of jest in his eyes. He meant every word. This is madness, she whispered. No, Addison. Madness is choosing to suffer when you've been handed a way out. He leaned back, his voice cool but piercing. I'm offering you stability, comfort, and a future. All you have to do is something you can already give, bear a child. Addison crossed her arms tightly over her chest, shielding herself from the weight of his gaze. Pride warred with desperation inside her. Every day was a fight for food, for warmth, for dignity. And now, here sat a man who could erase all of that with the stroke of a pen. But at what cost? What happens after, she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. After the baby is born. You'll walk away, Andrew said, with money, with freedom, no ties, no obligations. Her laugh this time was bitter. And how do I know you won't change your mind? Drag me into court, treat me like I don't exist once it's convenient. He said, I don't enter agreements without ensuring all parties' benefits. This would be legally binding, irrevocable. Neither of us could change the terms. She studied him in silence. He looked back at her without flinching. In his world, contracts were gospel, and she knew he wasn't bluffing. Still, her pride clawed at her. And if I say no, Andrew's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though it held no warmth. Then you return to the streets. You keep fighting the cold, the hunger, the invisibility. The choice is yours. His words landed like a stone in her chest. She wanted to hate him for the arrogance, for the cruelty. But what she hated more was the truth in them. He had trapped her, not with chains, but with the sharp edges of reality. Why, she demanded suddenly, her voice rising. Why me, a man like you with your money, your power you could adopt? Or find one of those women in society who are desperate to be seen with a perfect family? Why come to me? Andrew's expression shifted, the steel softening into something more profound, though no less firm, because I want something mine. My blood, my heir. Adoption is a complication. Marriage is an illusion. This is control. The coldness in his words made her shiver. And yet, for the first time, she saw not just a billionaire dictating terms, but a man shackled by his own hunger for permanence. She looked down at the paper she still clutched in her hand. Her sketch lines and shadows of a world she wanted, but could never have. Could this offer be her escape, or her destruction? I need time, Addison said at last, her voice steadier than she felt. Andrew nodded once, as if he had already anticipated her answer. You have 24 hours. After that, the offer is gone. He rose from his seat with the grace of a man who always left the final word behind. Without another glance, he walked out, his footsteps echoing in the quiet cafe. Addison sat frozen, the pencil still in her fingers, her heart a storm she could not quell. 24 hours. That was all the time she had to decide whether to sell her soul for survival or hold on to the scraps of pride that had kept her alive this long. And she realized she had a choice for the first time in years. The city never slept, but for Addison Carter that night felt like an endless descent into silence. After leaving the cafe, she walked aimlessly through the streets, the December wind cutting through her thin coat as if it were nothing. Every step echoed with Andrew Moore's voice, cold and commanding, offering her what felt less like a choice and more like a verdict. 24 hours. The words pulsed through her mind with every tick of the invisible clock. She reached a small park, the kind of place families visited in the summer, but abandoned when the air turned cruel. She sank onto a bench, her sketch crumpled in her hands. The city stretched out around her, a jungle of glass and light, indifferent to her existence. Addison stared at the night sky, clouded and gray, and thought of her mother, a woman with hands worn from labor and a voice that always carried a melody, even in hardship. "Opportunities come only once, Addie," her mother used to say. "You grab them, or you watch them pass you by." But what kind of opportunity was this? To sell her body, her motherhood, in exchange for comfort. Her pride recoiled at the thought. She had fought so long to keep some semblance of dignity, even while sleeping under awnings and surviving on scraps. To surrender that now felt like betraying everything she had endured. And yet, the reality was harsher than pride. She was tired of hunger, of cold, of being invisible. Her body was thin, her spirit stretched thin too. She imagined herself in another month, another year, still sitting on the same sidewalks, still drawing dreams on scraps of paper no one cared to see. Could she bear that? Could she bear the endless cycle of survival with no end in sight? Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach, as if trying to feel the weight of a decision that had not yet been made. The thought of carrying a child she would never raise, twisted something deep within her. It was unbearable, and yet inevitable. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. She could not afford weakness. Across the city, Andrew Moore sat in the pristine quiet of his Manhattan penthouse, reviewing the document on the glass table before him. His lawyers had done well. The contract was airtight, leaving no room for ambiguity. Addison Carter would be cared for, housing, medical, and financial support, arranged meticulously. In return, she would relinquish any claim to the child. Andrew scanned each line, though he already knew them by heart. His nature was to confirm, verify, and ensure that everything followed the order he demanded. There was a control comfort, knowing that chaos had no place in his world. Still, his thoughts strayed, unwelcome, distracting. The memory of her eyes, sharp and unyielding, haunted him. Most people shrank before him, eager to please or desperate to impress. But she had stared him down, even as her circumstances betrayed her vulnerability. There was something raw and untamed about her, which unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He told himself it didn't matter. She was not special. She was simply the one who had appeared at the right time and place. But even as he tried to reduce her to coincidence, a flicker of something he refused to name stirred inside him. Andrew closed the contract, his expression hardening. Sentiment had no place in this. The hours crawled by for Addison. She walked the streets until her legs ached, until exhaustion forced her back to the park bench. The night was merciless, the wind biting her body, shivering uncontrollably. She curled into herself, wishing for warmth, for safety. The cruel irony was not lost on her. Within her reach lay a chance to have everything she had ever lacked. But it came with a cost she wasn't sure she could pay. Dawn broke reluctantly, a pale gray light washing over the city. Addison rose from the bench, stiff and cold, her stomach aching from emptiness. The town stirred to life around her, commuters, rushing horns, blaring children tugging at their parents' hands. She stood apart from it all, a ghost among the living. Her steps carried her to a diner. She pressed her hands against the window, watching people sip coffee, eat pancakes, laugh, as if life were simple. Her reflection in the glass showed her truth, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, a woman on the edge of vanishing. She turned away. The clock was still ticking. When Addison found herself standing outside the towering glass building on Fifth Avenue, she barely remembered how she had gotten there. The lobby loomed before her, pristine and intimidating, a place that screamed wealth and exclusivity. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the line between one life and another. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, eyeing her worn clothes with thinly veiled disapproval. Addison said, "I'm here for Andrew Moore." Her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Moments later, she was escorted to the elevator, its mirrored walls reflecting a woman she barely recognized. The doors opened to a private floor, and there he was, Andrew standing by the window, the city sprawling endlessly behind him. He turned when she entered. His gaze flickered briefly over her, unreadable as ever. "You've decided." Addison swallowed her throat dry. "I have, and—" She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing on her. Every instinct screamed at her, to run, to hold on to her last shred of pride. But pride could not keep her warm at night. Pride could not silence the hunger in her stomach or shield her from the winter wind. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice breaking on the last word. Andrew's expression did not change. He merely nodded, as though she had confirmed something inevitable. "Good. Then let's make it official." He gestured toward the table where the contract lay neatly arranged. A pen rested beside it, gleaming beneath the soft light. Addison approached slowly, her hands trembling. She picked up the contract, scanning the words, though the letters blurred before her eyes. Each line was a chain, binding her future to his design. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to keep reading. "This seems final," she murmured. "That's exactly what I want," Andrew replied. His voice was calm, unyielding. "And I hope it's what you want too." Her laugh was short, bitter. "Want isn't the right word." Still, she took the pen. Her hand hovered above the paper, her breath uneven. She thought of her mother, of nights spent wishing for a better life. She thought of the cold, the hunger, the invisibility. And she thought of the possibility, fragile, uncertain, that maybe this was her only chance to escape. With a swift motion, Addison signed her name. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper sealed more than a deal. It sealed her fate. Andrew took the contract, scanning her signature with quiet satisfaction. He closed the folder, his posture as composed as ever. "It's done." Addison exhaled a long, shaky breath. She had crossed the threshold. There was no going back. Andrew signaled to his assistant, who appeared as if conjured by silence. "Stephanie will take you to the car. You'll be moving into the Long Island estate today." Addison followed the woman, her steps heavy. As the elevator descended, she pressed her back against the mirrored wall, her reflection staring back with wide, uncertain eyes. She wanted to scream, to weep, to undo what she had just done. But instead, she straightened her shoulders, holding on to the fragile belief that perhaps this choice could lead her somewhere other than despair. Outside, a sleek black car waited. The city, once her prison, now seemed to blur into something else, a place of endings and beginnings. As she slid into the car, Addison glanced back at the towering building, at the man who had rewritten her future with a single offer. The door closed with a soft click, and the car pulled away. Her old life vanished in the rearview mirror, and ahead, an uncertain road unfolded. The drive from Manhattan to Long Island unfolded like a dream Addison could not fully grasp. The car glided along smooth highways, leaving behind the gray chaos of the city, the crumbling walls she knew too well, and the familiar corners where she had spent nights curled against the cold. Each passing mile seemed to strip her further from the life she had lived, and yet the weight in her chest did not lighten. Stephanie, Andrew's assistant, sat beside her in the back seat. The woman was composed, her voice warm, yet professional, as she tried to ease the silence. "You'll find the estate very comfortable," Stephanie said politely. "It's quite spacious, and you'll have everything you need, doctors, nutritionists, and even personal trainers if you wish. Mr. Moore wants the best care for you." Addison nodded faintly, though her mind was elsewhere. The words estate and care clashed with the reality of who she was. She had slept on sidewalks, eaten meals rescued from bins, lived in shadows. Suddenly, being ushered into comfort felt like stepping onto a stage where she did not belong. The car turned onto a long, tree-lined drive. The winter branches arched overhead, bare but majestic, leading to iron gates that swung open at their approach. Beyond them sprawled the Moore estate, manicured gardens dusted with frost fountains, frozen in elegant silence, and at the heart of it all, a mansion that rose like a fortress of marble and glass. Its sheer scale made Addison's breath hitch. The car slowed, circling a grand fountain, before stopping at the front steps. The double doors towered above her, framed by stone columns, their weight and grandeur enough to make her feel smaller than ever. "This way," Stephanie said, gently guiding her inside. The entrance hall was a world apart from anything Addison had known. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light across marble floors that gleamed like water. A sweeping staircase curved upward, its banisters polished to a shine. Every surface spoke of wealth, not just money, but generations of it, refined and deliberate. Addison's shoes squeaked faintly against the marble as she followed Stephanie down the hall. Her hands brushed against her coat, clutching it tighter, as if the fabric could shield her from the feeling of intrusion. Stephanie said, "I'll show you to your suite," her tone almost maternal now. "It's one of the best rooms in the house, with its own bathroom and balcony. If you need anything, anything at all, you only have to call." They entered a room in the east wing. Addison stopped at the threshold, stunned. The suite was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. A bed draped in linen sheets stood at its center, its headboard carved and grand. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens where the frost glimmered in the early evening light. A bathroom opened off to one side, its marble tub large enough to be a pool compared to the cramped showers of city shelters. "Your clothes will be taken care of," Stephanie continued. "We'll have new ones delivered to fit your needs. Meals will be served regularly, and the doctors will begin their routine checks tomorrow." Addison nodded numbly, barely able to absorb the words. Stephanie gave her a kind smile, then excused herself, leaving Addison alone in the cavernous room. For a long time, Addison stood still, her hands at her sides, her gaze wandering over the unfamiliar luxury. The sheets looked too soft to touch, and the furniture was too elegant for her weight. She crossed the room and sat carefully at the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the fabric as though it might vanish beneath her touch. It was strange. Just a day before she had been sleeping on frozen benches, her body curled against the wind. Now here she was, surrounded by silk and marble. And yet, the heaviness in her chest remained. Comfort, yes. Safety, yes. But also a gnawing reminder she was not a guest. She was part of a deal. Addison stood at the window that night, looking out over the gardens. The mansion's lights cast the grounds in a golden glow, but the vast dark of winter was beyond them. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, her reflection merging with the world outside. Am I doing the right thing? The thought circled endlessly in her mind. Carrying a child was not a small act. Life was growing inside her, tied to her in ways no contract could erase. Yet, at the end of it, she would walk away. Could she? Her heart ached with the question, but no answer came. Behind her, the door creaked open. Addison turned to see Andrew standing in the doorway. He was dressed in dark clothes, his posture as impeccable as ever, his expression unreadable. "I trust everything is to your satisfaction," he said. Addison straightened her hand, falling from the window. "It's more than I've ever seen." "Good," Andrew replied. His tone was clipped businesslike, yet his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. "If you need anything, ask Stephanie. I want you to be well." The words were simple, but they unsettled her. Was it genuine concern or simply a desire to protect his investment? "I'll be fine," Addison said softly, though the truth was far from certain. Andrew gave a slight nod, then left his footsteps fading into the hall's silence. Addison exhaled, turning back to the window. The mansion might have been warm, but she still felt the chill of the world she had left behind. The following days settled into a routine. Meals arrived at precise hours and were served by staff who treated her with courteous detachment. Doctors visited, checking her health, prescribing vitamins, and ensuring she was in the best condition to carry a child. Addison complied, but each examination reminded her of the contract's weight, that her body was no longer entirely her own. Andrew remained distant, often away in meetings. His presence felt more through the house's silence than his actual company. But sometimes, unexpectedly, they crossed paths. Once in the hallway, he asked, "Are you comfortable?" His tone was formal, but something was questioning in his eyes. Another time, she passed him in the library, where he sat surrounded by books and documents. He looked up briefly, their eyes meeting across the vast room. Neither spoke, but the moment lingered like a shadow between them. Addison could not decide what unsettled her more, his indifference, or the possibility that it wasn't indifference. One evening, Addison wandered through the mansion, restless. She found herself in a gallery-like hall, where paintings lined the walls. Landscapes, portraits, abstract strokes of color, all signs of wealth, collected over generations. She stopped before one in particular, a mother and child rendered in oil, their faces soft, tender. Something in her chest tightened. She stood there for what felt like hours, until she sensed movement behind her. Andrew again. His presence filled the room, steady and deliberate. "You like that painting?" he observed. "It's beautiful," Addison said. Her voice trembled with something unspoken. Andrew regarded the painting, his profile illuminated by the chandelier above. "It's from the 18th century, a French artist. It belonged to my mother." There was a pause, rare and fragile. "She must have loved it," Addison said quietly. "She did." Andrew admitted, his voice lower, now edged with memory. For a moment, the mask slipped. Addison glimpsed not the billionaire, not the man of contracts, but a son remembering a mother who had once held him. And in that fleeting glimpse, something shifted between them. Andrew straightened his composure, returning. "Dinner will be served soon," he said before turning and leaving. Addison remained by the painting, her heart unsteady. The mansion was filled with wealth and silences she did not yet understand. And behind those silences perhaps was a man more complicated than she had imagined. As Addison lay in the vast bed that night, her thoughts circled back to the question that refused to leave her. Was she doing the right thing? She pressed a hand against her stomach, not yet carrying life, but preparing for it. Somewhere in the quiet halls of the mansion, Andrew moved through his world of control, while she lay awake, caught between gratitude and fear. She closed her eyes, listening to the faint hum of the house, and realized that her story had only just begun. Winter deepened over Long Island, pressing its icy breath against the windows of the Moore estate. Inside, warmth rained fires in marble hearths, golden lamps glowing over polished wood, the quiet hum of staff moving discreetly through endless halls. However, for Addison Carter, warmth was not the same as belonging. She had been in the mansion for weeks, long enough for her body to show the first quiet signs of change. A missed cycle confirmed what the doctors had already predicted. Her body had accepted its contracted role. The child, Andrew Moore's heir, was already a silent presence within her, shaping her future with every passing day. Addison often stood at the balcony of her suite, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, watching the gardens below stretch into winter's silence. She could not yet feel life moving inside her, but she knew it was there. And with that knowledge came a storm of emotions. Some days she felt defiant, determined to keep her heart walled off, to remind herself that this child was not hers. Other days, fear seeped in whispering questions she could not silence. What if she grew attached? What if she could not let go? At night she dreamed of small hands grasping hers, of laughter echoing through the cold marble halls. She would wake with tears, chastising herself for letting hope take root. The mansion's routines wrapped around her like velvet chains. Meals arrived at precise hours, balanced, nutritious, crafted by chefs who seemed to measure each ingredient for perfection. Doctors visited frequently, checking her blood pressure, prescribing vitamins, scanning her body as though she were a vessel to be safeguarded. Addison cooperated, but with every needle prick, every chart marked with her name, she felt less like a woman and more like a project. Andrew himself remained largely a shadow. He came and went at odd hours, his life consumed by meetings, calls, and the endless machinery of his empire. Yet even in his absence, his presence lingered. The staff spoke his name with reverence, their footsteps quickening when he entered a room. His power filled the air like static. Addison tried to avoid him, retreating into corners of the mansion where silence lived. And yet fate, or perhaps something else, kept drawing them together. One morning, Addison found a package at the entrance of her suite. It was wrapped in simple paper, with a small card tucked into the ribbon. For your sketches. A. Inside lay a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of fine pencils, the kind she had once only seen in art stores she could never afford to enter. Addison sat on the bed, staring at the gift. She had mentioned her drawing only once offhandedly, in that cafe weeks ago. She had not expected him to remember. She ran her fingers over the smooth pages, a lump rising in her throat. This was not grand, like the chandeliers, or the endless meals. It was small, personal, and somehow that made it heavier. When she saw him later that day, passing in the hall with his usual steady stride, she stopped him. "Thank you," she said, holding the sketchbook against her chest. Andrew paused, his gaze flicking to the object, then back to her. "It might help." "It does." Addison admitted, her voice soft. "I didn't expect this." For a moment, something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Then his mask returned. Good. He moved on, leaving her standing there, clutching the sketchbook like it were more precious than all the gold in the mansion. Days stretched into weeks, and with them came the first doctor's appointment Andrew chose to attend. He insisted it was practical and wanted to ensure everything proceeded as expected. Yet something shifted when they sat together in the sterile white room, the monitor glowing with blurred images. "There it is," the doctor said, pointing. A faint flicker, a rhythm like distant drums filled the room. The heartbeat. Addison's breath caught. Her eyes filled against her will, though she turned her head to hide it. Andrew stood beside her, arms folded, his face carved from stone. But his eyes were locked on the screen, his composure cracking briefly. Awe, almost reverence, crossed his features. For the first time, Addison saw him not as a billionaire or a strategist, but as a man staring at something greater than himself. The ride back to the mansion was silent. The usual coldness between them carried a new weight charged with what they had just witnessed. Addison stared out the window, her hand unconsciously resting on her stomach. When the car stopped, Andrew surprised her by opening the door for her. "Everything will continue as planned," he said, his tone softer than usual. Addison hesitated. "Planned?" she echoed. "Is that all this is for you?" "A plan." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. He only looked at her, something unspoken in his eyes, before turning away. That night Addison sketched. The lines poured onto the paper figures. She could not name shapes that felt like echoes of what she carried inside her. She tried to draw walls around them, barriers that kept her from reaching too far, but her hand betrayed her. What emerged was softer, the curve of a small face, the delicate outline of hands. She set the pencil down, pressing her palms to her eyes. "This isn't mine," she told herself. "Don't forget that." But her heart refused to obey. Weeks later, Addison encountered Andrew in the library again. He was seated at the long oak table, a folder of documents spread before him. The lamplight cast his features in sharp relief, his expression focused, unyielding. "You work constantly," she said, before she could stop herself. Andrew looked up, faintly surprised. "That's how I built everything I have. And what does it give you?" Addison asked, her voice carrying more courage than she felt. "You plan, you calculate, you control everything. But where does it end?" He studied her, silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back, folding his hands. "It succeeds in security. I'm never losing what I've built." Addison shook her head, a small, incredulous smile tugging at her lips. "You can plan everything in the world, Andrew. But you can't plan feelings. You can't control life, no matter how much money you have." Her words struck him visibly. His eyes narrowed as if unused to such defiance. "Feelings are unreliable. They cost more than they give." Or maybe, Addison said softly, "they're the only things worth the cost." Silence fell heavy and charged. Andrew's gaze locked on hers, and for a fleeting second, something shifted. Something raw, uncertain, dangerously close to vulnerable. But then, as always, he pulled back. "Get some rest," he said curtly, gathering his papers. He left the room, his stride firm. But Addison knew her words had landed. She had seen it in his eyes, the momentary fracture in his armor. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the baby's heartbeat still echoing in her ears. For the first time since stepping into this golden cage, she wondered if Andrew Moore's heart, buried beneath layers of steel and ice, might be capable of something he didn't yet understand. And that dangerous, fragile thought terrified her more than the contract itself. The weeks after the first appointment passed with a strange, delicate rhythm. The days folded into one another, gilded by routine, yet charged with an undercurrent neither Addison nor Andrew could name. The mansion's silence seemed to grow more intimate, as though the walls themselves were listening. Addison's body had begun to change. Once lean from years of scarcity, her waist softened with the quiet swell of new life. Mornings brought nausea, and her appetite shifted unpredictably, cravings rising for things she hadn't thought of in years: warm cornbread, spiced tea, ripe peaches, though it was the dead of winter. The staff accommodated every request without hesitation, yet the indulgence unsettled her. Luxury was supposed to be a gift, but it felt more like a reminder in her heart. She was here because her body now belonged to a contract. Still, when night fell and she pressed her palm against the subtle curve of her stomach, Addison knew the truth was more complicated. Something was growing inside her, something fragile and miraculous. And though she tried to remind herself it was not hers, that it never could be, her body whispered otherwise. The second appointment arrived on a pale morning in February. Andrew insisted on accompanying her again. He explained it practically. I must ensure the doctors do their jobs. But Addison noticed how his hand lingered on the back of the car seat, and his gaze flicked toward her reflection in the window during the drive. At the clinic, the doctor greeted them warmly. Addison lay on the examination bed, the cool gel pressed to her skin. She braced for the sound, the rapid rhythm of life, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The monitor flickered with images, the grainy outlines of something unmistakably alive. Then the sound came, not one, but two. Two heartbeats, strong and steady, filling the room with their relentless music. Addison's eyes widened. "Two," she whispered, turning toward the doctor. "Yes," the doctor confirmed with a smile. "You're carrying twins. Both look healthy, growing well." For a moment the world tilted. Addison's hand shot to her stomach as though trying to shield both lives simultaneously. Her throat tightened, and tears blurred her vision. Twins. She would have to let go of not just one child, but two. Beside her, Andrew was silent, his eyes fixed on the monitor, his lips parted slightly as though words had abandoned him. The mask he wore so carefully slipped, and what emerged was raw awe, reverence, and something dangerously close to fear. "Two," he murmured almost to himself. The doctor continued speaking measurements, medical terms, reassurances, but neither truly listened. The twin heartbeats consumed the air, echoing in their minds, long after they left the room. The car ride back to the mansion was heavy with silence, though not the same kind of silence as before. It was charged, brimming with unspoken thoughts. Addison stared out the window, her hand cradling her belly. 2 lives. She should have felt joy, but instead, her heart twisted with conflict. How could she carry them for months, feel them move inside her, only to walk away? The idea that had once seemed impossible now felt unbearable. Andrew's hands gripped the steering wheel with unusual tension. He was a man who thrived on control and planned every detail of his empire. Yet he faced something he could not predict for the first time. 2 children, 2 futures. He could not reduce 2 pieces of himself to contracts and clauses. Finally, Addison broke the silence. "You don't seem like someone who gets surprised easily." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I don't. But this is different." "Scary?" she asked softly. His eyes flicked toward her, then back to the road. "No." "Impressive. I know 2 new lives will depend on me in a few months." Addison's chest ached at his words. "They also depend on me for now." "I know." His voice softened, though his gaze remained fixed forward. "That's why I want to make sure you're well. Not just physically, Addison. In every way." The sincerity in his tone unsettled her. She had told herself she was nothing more than a vessel for weeks, but he acknowledged her as something more. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The revelation of twins altered the atmosphere of the mansion. Preparations began immediately. Stephanie oversaw the transformation of a nursery, choosing cribs and soft blankets, filling the space with quiet hues. Addison would stand in the doorway sometimes, watching the room evolve. Each detail cut deeper, reminding her that these children would never fall asleep in her arms. Andrew's behavior changed too, though subtly enough to be deniable. He appeared more frequently, joining her at meals, or pausing to ask how she felt. Once he brought her a tray of tea himself, an awkward gesture that surprised even him. Another evening she discovered new pillows in her room, firmer and softer, arranged without comment, but accompanied by a note in his unmistakable hand, "To help you rest." Addison read it 3 times before pressing the paper against her chest. One evening, Addison sat in the garden, wrapped in a blanket. The air was crisp stars barely visible against the city's distant glow. She traced lines in her sketchbook, absent shapes she couldn't yet define. Andrew appeared, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He stood beside her, silent at first, gazing at the barren trees. "You like this spot," he said finally. "I like the silence," Addison replied. "It helps me think. Thinking isn't always good," he murmured. She looked up at him, half smiling. "Try telling that to someone silent, their whole life." His eyes lingered on her unreadable, before drifting back to the sky. Sometimes, being surrounded by people doesn't help either. Addison studied him in the dim light, noticing the weariness etched into his features. For the first time, she wondered if loneliness haunted him as profoundly as it did her. Maybe she said quietly, "You need something you can't control." He glanced at her sharply, but she didn't look away. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the weight of everything between them, the contract, the unborn children, the walls they had built, hung like a fragile thread. Andrew turned away first, his posture rigid. "Get some rest," he said before retreating toward the house. Addison exhaled, her hands trembling against the sketchbook. She had seen it again, the fracture in his armor, and it terrified her how much she wanted to see more. The following weeks passed with new intensity. Addison felt the first flutter of movement, a faint ripple beneath her skin. She froze when it happened, tears welling unbidden. She was not supposed to feel this, or let her heart expand around something she would lose. But the truth could no longer be denied. She was already connected. Andrew noticed the shift, too. At dinners, his gaze lingered longer. In conversations, his tone softened, though his words remained precise. Once he asked her if she had thought of names. She laughed bitterly. "That's not my choice to make." "It may be," he said. The suggestion startled her. It was the first time he had offered her a place in the children's future, however small. Addison didn't answer. But that night she wrote names in the margins of her sketchbook, tracing them with hesitant fingers, before tearing the page out and hiding it under her pillow. Their relationship was no longer just a transaction, though neither admitted it. Addison fought against her growing attachment, terrified of the inevitable. Andrew battled with emotions. He had never allowed himself to feel afraid of losing control. Once filled only with silence, the mansion carried something new, a fragile tension, hope, fear. Two lives grew between them, binding them in ways no contract could contain. And both of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again, though neither dared to say it. Spring crept across Long Island, softening the air, coaxing buds from the branches of trees that had stood bare all winter. In the gardens of the Moore estate, daffodils pierced the soil, their yellow crowns, bright against the lingering chill. For Addison, the season's change mirrored her own body's transformation. Her belly had grown with the undeniable curve of life, her movements slower, more deliberate. Every flutter, every turn from within, anchored her to the two small beings she carried. The doctors spoke of progress in clinical terms, charts and measurements. But to Addison, each moment was more profound than science. In the quiet of her suite, she would press her hands to her stomach, whispering words no one else could hear. She tried not to name them, tried not to dream of futures she could not have, but still her heart betrayed her. They were hers in ways no contract could sever. At times, guilt pressed down on her like a stone. She had agreed to this arrangement and signed her name on the paper, declaring she would walk away. Yet how could a mother's body agree to let go of what grew inside her? Each day made the promise harder to imagine keeping. Andrew, too, had changed, though, in ways less visible. His empire continued, meetings and calls filling his days, Yet he returned to the mansion earlier than before. At dinners, he lingered longer, asking Addison about her health, appetite, and sleep. His words were simple, often clipped, but she sensed something beneath them. One evening, she found a shawl draped across the back of a chair on her balcony. Soft cashmere, dyed the color of twilight. No note accompanied it, but Addison knew where it had come from. Another time, when nausea struck hard, she discovered ginger tea waiting on her nightstand, still steaming. He never mentioned these gestures, and she never confronted him. Yet each one left a mark, subtle threads weaving a tapestry she tried not to see. One afternoon, restless Addison wandered deeper into the mansion than she had before. She found herself at the end of a long corridor, where a door stood ajar. She hesitated, then gently pushed it open. Inside was a study smaller than the grand library, filled with old leather and cedar scent. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn from use. At the center sat Andrew, not behind a desk, but in a chair, a framed photograph cradled in his hands. He did not hear her at first. His gaze was fixed on the picture, his posture unguarded, almost fragile. Addison caught a glimpse as she stepped closer. A woman's face, smiling softly eyes, mirrored Andrew's. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quietly. Andrew started quickly setting the photograph back on the desk. The mask returned to his features, though not as firmly as before. "It's nothing," he replied. Addison lingered near the door. "She was essential to you." He looked at her eyes, narrowing as if deciding whether to respond. At last he said, "My mother. This was her room. I kept it the way she left it." Addison stepped closer, drawn by something tender in his tone. "She looks kind. She was." Andrew admitted, his voice lower now. "She believed in things I never understood. Faith, trust, love. She used to tell me life wasn't meant to be controlled. It was only lived." Addison tilted her head, studying him. "And you didn't believe her?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "I wanted to. But after she died, all I saw was how easily things fall apart when you rely on feelings." The silence stretched heavy but not cold. Addison felt the weight of his words, the wound that shaped the man before her. For the first time, she did not see Andrew Moore, the billionaire, the strategist, the man of contracts. She saw a son without a mother who had once taught him to believe in what he now rejected. She wanted to reach out to close the distance between them, but fear held her still. Andrew cleared his throat, straightening. "You should rest. The doctors don't want you on your feet too long." The moment slipped away, but Addison carried it with her, long after she returned to her room. The outside world, which had seemed so far removed, soon pressed its shadow against the fragile balance they had found. One evening, as Andrew sat with his advisors in the mansion's smaller dining room, Addison overheard fragments of conversation. "Rumors are circling. Someone saw her at the clinic. Questions will come." Andrew's voice was firm. "It will be handled. Discretion is non-negotiable." "Handled," how another voice pressed. "If the press learns a homeless woman is carrying your heirs?" Addison froze, her breath catching. The words struck with brutal clarity. This was not only about her and Andrew. It was about power, perception, and control. She was a liability to the world, a potential scandal to be buried. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The babies kicked softly, reminding her they were real, that they existed beyond contracts and reputations. Fear gnawed at her. If the world knew, what would happen? Would Andrew protect her, or would she become expendable once the children were born? The next morning, she found him in the garden. He stood at the fountain's edge, hands in his pockets, his posture sharp against the rising sun. "You're worried," Addison said, approaching. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. You overheard? She crossed her arms over her growing belly. They think I'm a scandal. Andrew's gaze hardened. They think you're a variable. People like them don't see you for who you are, only for the risk you represent. And what do you see? She asked, her voice trembling, despite her resolve. For a moment he didn't answer. The air thickened, and the fountain's trickle was the only sound. Then quietly he said, I see someone stronger than they'll ever understand. Addison's breath caught. The sincerity in his tone left her shaken. The days that followed carried both light and shadow. Andrew became more present, not just in duty, but in presence. He asked questions not only about her health, but about her art, her past, the things that shaped her. Sometimes they sat together in the evenings, not speaking much, simply sharing the same silence. Yet the shadows remained. Addison felt them in the way the staff's eyes lingered too long in the hushed conversations that ended when she entered a room. She was both cared for and judged, cradled and caged. One evening as she sketched in the sitting room, Andrew entered. He watched her for a moment before asking, What are you drawing? She hesitated, then turned the book to show him a pair of hands, small and fragile, reaching upward. His eyes softened. They're beautiful. They're not finished, Addison murmured. Neither are they, he said quietly, nodding toward her belly. The words lingered in the air, pulling them closer to something neither dared to name. As spring deepened, Addison walked the gardens more often, her steps slow, her body heavy with the twins' weight. Andrew accompanied her sometimes. His stride matched hers, and his silence was different now, less cold and more companionable. Once, as they paused beneath a blossoming tree, Addison pressed a hand to her back, wincing. Andrew immediately reached out, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. You're pushing yourself, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard. I'm fine, Addison replied, though her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. He didn't let go. You don't have to be. They stood like that momentarily, the world hushed around them, blossoms drifting in the breeze. Then Addison stepped back, breaking the spell. Thank you, she whispered. Andrew inclined his head, but the look in his eyes lingered long after. Nights grew heavier for Addison as the twins stirred within her, restless and alive. Sleep eluded her, her thoughts tangled between fear and longing. She pressed her hands to her stomach, whispering promises she had no right to make. Yet somewhere deep inside, hope flickered that perhaps against all reason, this story might not end the way the contract demanded. And though she would never say it aloud, she sensed Andrew was beginning to wonder the same. The final weeks were heavy with waiting. The mansion, usually a place of calculated quiet, seemed to pulse with anticipation. Addison felt it in the air, in the way the staff moved with hushed efficiency, in the way Andrew appeared more often than before, his presence steady though rarely acknowledged aloud. Her body bore the weight of the twins with every step. Her back ached, her breath shortened, and her nights were restless. The doctor's visits grew more frequent, their voices reassuring, yet Addison knew her body was carrying more than just life. It brought fear, hope, and an ending she dreaded. In the evenings, she sat by the window of her suite, watching the world slip into twilight. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the restless kicks and turns inside. Sometimes she whispered to them. Not names, never names, but promises she didn't know if she could keep. Promises of love, of a bond that existed even if she would one day be forced to let go. Andrew's behavior had shifted subtly, but unmistakably. He attended nearly every medical appointment, his tall frame looming near her, as the doctors spoke in measured tones. He rarely interrupted, but his questions were precise, his eyes sharp as though memorizing every detail of their growth. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Addison ate breakfast late. To her surprise, Andrew was still there, sitting at the head of the long table, a cup of coffee untouched before him. "You're pale," he observed as she entered. Addison admitted it was a long night, lowering herself carefully into a chair. He studied her for a moment. Then, without speaking, he pushed a bowl of fruit toward her, freshly sliced, arranged neatly. "Eat. It will help." She looked at the offering, then at him. The gesture was simple, almost domestic, but it startled her more than any grand luxuries he had provided. "Thank you," she said softly. His gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them, before he returned to his coffee. The day it happened began like any other. The morning was cool, the gardens bathed in soft light. Addison strolled along the path, Stephanie by her side, speaking lightly about preparations for the nursery. The twins shifted restlessly inside her, their movements stronger now, urgent. Then, without warning, a sharp pain gripped her lower abdomen. Addison gasped, clutching at her belly. Stephanie's expression changed instantly. Contractions. Addison nodded, her face pale. The pain came again, sharper this time, stealing her breath. Within minutes, the household shifted into motion. The driver readied the car, doctors were contacted, and Andrew appeared at the doorway, his face taut with urgency. "She's in labor," Stephanie said quickly. Andrew's eyes locked on Addison, who stood trembling, her hands pressed against her swollen belly. For the first time, his composure cracked, not into fear, but into something fiercer. Determination. "Get the car," he ordered. Then, stepping toward Addison, his voice lowered. "You'll be fine. I'm with you." The ride to the hospital blurred in a haze of pain and panic. Addison sat in the back seat, Stephanie beside her, guiding her breathing. Andrew sat opposite, his gaze fixed on her, his hand gripping hers with a firmness that surprised them both. "You'll be all right," he said again, his voice low, steady. She squeezed his hand, her nails digging into his skin as another contraction tore through her. "Don't let go," she whispered. "I won't." Andrew replied, and he didn't. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Nurses rushed her into a delivery room, doctors barking orders, lights glaring. Andrew followed, despite protests. "Sir, you'll need to wait outside." "I'm staying," he interrupted, his voice sharp with authority. "I won't leave her." And so, he stayed. Addison lay on the bed, her body racked with waves of pain, sweat dampening her brow. Andrew stood beside her, one hand gripping hers, the other steady at her shoulder. His eyes, usually so controlled, now betrayed an intensity he couldn't conceal. Hours passed in a blur of contractions and whispered encouragement. Addison screamed, sobbed, and cursed, but never once did Andrew's hand leave hers. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were anchors. "You're stronger than this pain. You can do this. I'm here." At last, the moment came. Addison's cries filled the room, raw and desperate, until they were joined by another sound, a sharp, fragile wail that pierced the air. The first twin, a boy. Addison's tears spilled freely as the doctor lifted the small, writhing body, his skin flushed, his cries demanding. The baby was placed briefly on a table, examined, then swaddled in a blanket, before being held up for her to see. Her heart broke open. Before she could even process, another wave of pain gripped her. Minutes later, the second cry joined the first, higher, softer, but no less powerful. A girl. The room buzzed with motion, doctors and nurses, working with brisk efficiency. But for Addison, time stopped. Two voices filled the air, voices that had been heartbeats within her for months. She reached out with trembling hands, and for a moment the babies were placed against her chest. Her tears wet their tiny foreheads. She memorized everything, the softness of their cheeks, the smallness of their fingers curling instinctively around hers, the warmth of their bodies. She knew this moment would be brief, perhaps the only time she would simultaneously hold them. "Beautiful," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're both so lovely." Andrew stood at her side, silent, unmoving. Then slowly he reached forward. His hands steady yet unpracticed, took the boy from the nurse. For a moment, the billionaire who controlled empires was gone. In his place stood a man holding his son for the first time. His face softened, the lines of power and calculation erased. His eyes, sharp as steel in the boardroom, glistened as he stared at the child. "They're perfect," he murmured. His voice cracked on the last word. When the girl was placed in his other arm, Andrew closed his eyes briefly, as if sealing the moment into his soul. Addison watched him, her own heart unraveling. She had expected him to see heirs, successors, and legacy. Instead, she saw a father, and it terrified her more than anything. That night, Addison lay in her hospital bed, exhausted, her body aching. The babies rested in their bassinets nearby, small chests rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Andrew sat beside them, his gaze unwavering, as though the empire he had built no longer mattered. Stephanie entered quietly, carrying coffee. She glanced at Andrew. "Everything all right, sir?" He looked up. His expression softened in a way she had never seen. For the first time, he said, "It is." When Stephanie left, Addison turned her head toward him. "You've changed." Andrew looked at her, his eyes shadowed but earnest. They changed everything. Addison swallowed hard, her throat tight. "And me?" The question hung between them, fragile, dangerous. Andrew didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to her bed, and placed the girl gently in her arms. Then he met her eyes. "You were incredible," he said quietly, "and I'll never forget that." Addison held the child close, her tears falling freely. She wanted to believe his words, to let them root in her heart. But the contract loomed like a shadow, reminding her that this moment, no matter how beautiful, could not last. As dawn broke over the city, Andrew remained by the bassinets, watching his children sleep. The man who had built his life on control now sat in awe of the only thing he could never fully command: love. Addison closed her eyes, listening to the soft breaths of the twins, her heart breaking with every sound. She knew the days ahead would test her more than anything she had ever endured. But for now, in that fragile dawn, they were together. A father, a mother, and two lives that bound them more deeply than any contract ever could. The weeks following the twins' birth unfolded in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Addison spent her days between the nursery and her own room, her body still recovering from the trial of labor, the ache in her muscles, the tenderness of her skin. The shadows beneath her eyes faded when she leaned over the bassinets and saw them sleeping. Two small chests rising and falling, two pairs of fingers curling instinctively around hers. She tried to remind herself that every touch, every lullaby whispered in the quiet of the night, was temporary. The contract was unyielding. A shadow stretched across every joyful moment. And yet her heart, disobedient and wild, loved them fiercely. Andrew was never far. He moved through the nursery with a quiet intensity, his large hands awkward but careful as he changed diapers or adjusted blankets. Sometimes Addison would wake in the night to find him already there, standing over the bassinets, his expression softened into something she had once believed impossible for him. "Go back to sleep," he would tell her gently when he caught her watching. "I've got them." In those moments, Addison felt the walls she had built begin to crack. The mansion itself seemed transformed by the presence of the twins. Where once silence had ruled, now there were cries, laughter, soft coos that echoed down marble hallways. Staff members moved with lighter steps, their faces betraying smiles they hadn't worn before. Even Stephanie, always so composed, often lingered in the nursery, her eyes shining as she cradled the infants. But for Addison, joy was tangled with dread. Each day brought her closer to the inevitable. The contract remained signed in black ink, demanding her departure once her role was fulfilled. She had thought she could endure. It had convinced herself she could be strong enough to walk away. But the thought of leaving them, her son, her daughter, tore at her soul like glass. And there was Andrew. He was changing too, though she wasn't sure he realized it. He still carried the air of a man in control, yet the edges had softened. He asked her how she felt more often now, and listened when she answered. Once during a rare afternoon when both twins slept simultaneously, he sat beside her in the sunlit nursery. "They look peaceful," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the bassinets. Addison nodded her hand, brushing the curls from her daughter's forehead. "They trust us," she said softly. "They trust you," Andrew corrected. She glanced at him. "And you. They know you're here." His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, something unspoken hung in the air. He looked away first, his jaw tightening as if afraid to admit how much her words meant. The day came too soon. Addison packed slowly, folding the few clothes she had been given, tucking away sketches she had drawn in the still hours of night. The nursery was quiet behind her, the twins napping after their morning feed. She lingered by their cribs, pressing kisses to their cheeks, breathing them in as though trying to memorize their scent. Stephanie appeared at the door, her expression soft. "Is everything ready?" Addison swallowed, her throat tight. "Yes, you don't have to do this," Stephanie whispered. "Not if I do." Addison interrupted, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is what was agreed." Stephanie hesitated, but said no more. Downstairs, Andrew waited in the grand foyer. He stood by the door, his posture tense, his eyes unreadable, as Addison descended the stairs with her small suitcase. Their gazes met, and their silence was sharper than any blade. "Everything's ready," Addison said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. Andrew didn't answer immediately. He looked at the suitcase, then back at her, something flickering in his eyes. At last he spoke, his voice low. "Are you really leaving?" Addison's chest ached. "That was the deal. I've done my part. Now it's time to move on." He stepped closer, his gaze burning into hers. "And you think you can walk away? After all this?" Her resolve wavered, but she lifted her chin. "I don't have a choice." For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the contract, the document that had bound them together. He held it in his hands, staring at it, as though it were suddenly meaningless. "This contract," he said, his voice steadier, "now should never have defined what's between us." Before Addison could respond, he tore the pages in half. The sound echoed through the foyer, sharp and final. He repeatedly pulled them until the paper was in fragments on the polished floor. Addison froze, her breath catching. "Andrew, I don't want this to end here," he said, stepping closer. His voice cracked, raw with emotion. "I don't want you to go. I need you, Addison. Not just because of the twins, but because you brought something into my life I didn't know I was missing." Her heart pounded, torn between hope and fear. "You can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple." He admitted, his eyes locked on hers. "Nothing about this has been simple for me. But these past months have shown me something I've been too afraid to admit. I can't live behind walls forever. I need more than control. I need you. Tears filled her eyes. How do I know this is real? How do I know you won't change your mind and pull away when things get hard? Andrew's expression softened, though his voice was fierce. It left me empty because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone. You showed me I don't have to be afraid of being human. Yes, it scares me. But losing you scares me more. Addison's tears spilled freely. I fell in love with you, Andrew, she confessed, her voice breaking. But I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I trust that you won't do the same? He stepped closer, so close, she could feel the warmth of his breath. Because you changed everything for me. And I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it, Addison, but I'll try every day for the rest of my life if you let me. Her defenses crumbled, her heart pounding wildly. Still, fear lingered. And if it doesn't work, she whispered, then we'll try again, Andrew said, and again, until it does. I won't give up on you. Not ever. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Addison searched his eyes, looking for deception, for control, but found only truth. Slowly she nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. Relief washed over Andrew's face, raw and unguarded. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, afraid she might vanish if he let go. For the first time, Addison felt not like a guest, not like a contract, but like she belonged. Upstairs, the twins stirred, their cries echoing faintly through the halls. Addison pulled back, wiping her tears, and Andrew's gaze followed hers toward the sound. Let's go to them, he said softly. Together they climbed the stairs, side by side, toward the nursery, where two new lives waited. Lives that had bound them together in ways no contract ever could. And for the first time, Addison allowed herself to hope that perhaps this beginning was not the end, but the start of something greater than they had ever imagined. Morning light spilled across the Moore estate, filtering through the nursery curtains, where the twins stirred. Their cries were softer now, more insistent than frantic, as though they had already begun to trust the world around them. Addison moved first, cradling their daughter against her chest, while Andrew lifted their son with a tenderness that would have once surprised him. The contract was gone, its remnants swept from the foyer floor, yet the choice it had forced remained etched in both their hearts. Addison had stayed not as a surrogate bound by obligation, but as a woman daring to hope and trust. And Andrew had chosen for the first time in his life to place his heart above his fear of losing control. The mansion no longer felt like a cage. It breathed with the sound of life, with laughter and soft lullabies, with the shuffle of hurried footsteps, when two tiny voices demanded more than their parents could give. Andrew was unaccustomed to failure, but fatherhood humbled him. The first time he tried to change a diaper, disaster struck, pins dropped, the blanket slipped, and the child wailed in protest. Addison's laughter rang out, bright and unrestrained, filling the nursery. He looked at her, then his hands clumsy, and for the first time since their meeting, he laughed too. She teased, "You're impossible at this," taking the baby from his arms. "I build empires," he retorted, though his smile softened the words. "I can learn this." And he did. Slowly, awkwardly, he learned. Late nights were spent pacing the nursery with a baby in his arms, mornings with bottles balanced clumsily, and evenings where exhaustion claimed him only after the twins were asleep. Each moment chipped away at the fortress he had built around himself, revealing a man Addison had begun to believe she might truly love. For Addison, trust was harder. She carried wounds deeper than hunger and cold. She had been discarded unseen, treated as though her worth began and ended with survival. Even now, surrounded by luxury, with Andrew at her side, shadows lingered. But Andrew did not push. He was patient in a way she hadn't expected. When she hesitated to speak of her past, he waited. When her fears rose in the night, he stayed silent, but steady, his hand finding hers in the dark. One evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the twins sleep in bassinets beside them, Addison finally told him about the nights in shelters, the days when she sketched to distract herself from hunger, the people who had passed her by, as though she were invisible. She expected judgment, perhaps even pity. But Andrew only listened. When she finished, he reached for her hand. "They didn't see you," he said quietly, "but I do." Tears filled her eyes, not from pain this time, but from the fragile healing those words began. Spring turned to summer, and with it came change. The nursery blossomed with toys, the gardens filled with laughter, as Addison carried the twins across the grass, their tiny fingers reaching for blossoms. Andrew began working more from the estate, his presence constant, and his empire managed with one eye, always on home. During one of those afternoons, as Addison sketched beneath a tree while the twins napped in a blanket nearby, Andrew approached with something in his hand, a small box, plain and unadorned. "Addison," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed a rare nervousness. "I spent my life believing love was weakness. You proved me wrong. You gave me a family, and more than that, you gave me a reason to be more than the man I was." He opened the box. Inside lay a simple ring, elegant but unpretentious. "Will you marry me?" Not because of a contract, not because of obligation, but because I love you. Addison stared, her breath catching. The woman who had once slept on sidewalks, invisible and forgotten, now stood at the center of a life she had never dared dream. "Yes," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, Andrew." He slid the ring onto her finger, then kissed her, not urgently, but with the quiet certainty of a man finally finding what he had been missing. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the estate's gardens beneath arches, woven with white roses, with only a handful of people present. Stephanie, a few trusted staff, and the twins dressed in tiny garments that drew laughter from everyone. Addison wore a gown simple yet elegant, her hair gathered in curls that framed her glowing face. Andrew, in a dark suit, looked at her as though she were the only person in the world. When they exchanged vows, they did not speak of wealth or legacy. They spoke of trust, healing, and love found in the unlikeliest places. "You showed me I could trust again," Addison said, her voice steady despite her tears, "that I wasn't invisible, that I was worthy of love. And you showed me that control isn't life." Andrew replied, "That love is not weakness but strength. I don't need to fear it when facing it with you." When they kissed, the applause was soft, heartfelt, and the twins' coos rang out like blessings carried on the summer air. The months that followed were filled with the chaos of family life. Sleepless nights gave way to mornings of laughter, milestones celebrated with awe, the twins' first steps across the nursery floor, their first words spoken in unsteady voices. Andrew marveled at them daily. Where once he had sought an heir, he now saw children unique and irreplaceable, their futures not trophies to his empire, but gifts he would nurture. Addison found herself whole again. Each day healed wounds she thought permanent. She painted, sketched, and filled the mansion with color. She laughed freely now, no longer guarded or afraid of vanishing. One autumn afternoon, she stood in the garden watching the twins play on the grass. Andrew joined her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then at the children, their laughter filling the air. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he said. "Because of you. Because of them." She leaned into him, her heart full. Years later, the mansion would still echo with laughter, still hold the warmth of a family that had been born not from contracts or control, but from choice, from love, from two broken souls who found healing in one another. The billionaire who had once believed love an illusion, and the woman who had once been invisible, now stood together at the center of a life neither had expected. And as the sun dipped low over Long Island, painting the sky in hues of gold, Addison whispered to Andrew, "We built this, not with contracts, with love." And he smiled, knowing she was right. And now, dear listener, what do you think of Andrew's decision? Was tearing up the contract the bravest choice of his life, or the only choice he could make? How would you have acted if you were in Addison's place? How would you rate this story on a scale of 0 to 10? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. And if you enjoyed it, share it with someone who believes love can come from the most unexpected places.